Well, hello. So I like to be respectful of people's time and start on time, although it's a very tiny show turnout today. That's okay. I know it's summer, beginning of summer. School just got out, and I got a number of emails just about different things that popped up for people that they'll tune in and watch our discussion and have submitted some written things to me um, and just some follow up. So, but aren't you guys so lucky? You get one-on-one time. And then Sarah, I didn't get to say hi to you, but I saw you at the committee the other day, but I didn't get to say hi because I was in and out. But very nice to see you there. So I will just go ahead and kick it off. Since just the two of us, especially just the two of you guys. We'll keep it really informal. I have an agenda, but we won't really stick to it. And Christina, I know I've already talked to you a little bit and then about legislative updates. Sarah, I know you're plugged in, so I don't really have to tell you, but there's just lots of discussion of education by the legislature last week, whether it be in hearings, the constitutional players convening, or the ledge days. So just lots of talk. I think the good news with that is that, they're paying attention to it, not just the committees themselves, but the whole legislature had breakout sessions that focused on school funding. So it is a topic, they are paying attention to it. I know there were some questions about different, like some funding streams and stuff from last time. I won't go I won't belabor that too much since it's just the two of you guys and we can dig into whatever details or pull up whatever, but if we go into Group D's shared drive, there's a number of resources in here. I'll break down stuff. So like the marijuana sales revenue, I know people are interested in that, of how much is coming in, where is it going? Same thing with like the trust lands. There's a management review in here I threw in there that covers last year's the fiscal year. I could bring that up if we want to dig more into that. And also the building maintenance study is in there too. I know that was something, I don't think you brought that up, Sarah. I think another gentleman did in the group last time. But all of those resources are in there. Like I said, I don't want to talk too much about them because I want to talk to Christina and Sarah. So what I will do is kind of what I did do, and I'm sorry I keep bringing up different screens, but I got lots of things open so I can pull up stuff if we want to see it. This is a summary, kind of different topics, very high level. I didn't go into the nitty gritty, but this is kind of so that we can use this to go off of for our discussion today. These are the things we talked about in May. So we can start by like kind of revisiting some of this or Sarah, I don't know, I would love to hear some of your takeaways on some of the activities last week, or if anything has any thoughts over the last month about school funding.
Okay, I don't know where to start.
Well, I know that's a broad kickoff, so if you want me to throw one of the topics at you, I'm happy to.
Yeah, throw one out there.
So teacher retention, teacher pay, the quality teacher payment, that was a discussion not only last week, but it's something that's come up in my previous 3 groups. So I know it's a hot topic, I feel like just across the board, and everything I talk about has to do with teacher retention and teacher recruitment.
Yeah. So I appreciated the conversation in the committee last week where I don't remember the people's names, but where they were talking about this topic, because I think the comment about holistic approach to teacher retention is really important. I think money is one factor, but I don't think you can throw money at people and make them happy. I think that's the factor that maybe kind of is a kick in the gut when it doesn't go well. But I really appreciated this holistic approach of teacher recruitment and retention, because I think it's a really big problem. And I think in the past month, I mean, I'm in Helena, so we cut a bunch of teaching positions since we last met. And I'm seeing new and mid-career teachers becoming more disengaged, I think. And I've known a lot of people who get non-renewal notices every year, and that's really hard to start a profession. Not knowing if your job's going to be there or not the next year. And then just a lot of people mid-career teachers not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, not seeing this is not a sustainable career to the end of towards retirement and looking to change professions. So I like the idea of giving time to teachers and meaningful time. I thought that was a really good suggestion. I like the idea of creating teacher leaders and giving teachers an avenue besides administration to really like progress in their field, if that makes sense, in terms of retaining teachers and giving them additional opportunities. And when they were talking about that, I was just thinking, man, if the state could fund some of those programs to get people into teacher leadership positions, that would be a way to up pay while giving people more responsibilities, possibly, if that makes sense.
And while you're talking, one of the things I brought up, and it's not necessarily the solution, but just to highlight the problem you're talking about, this is a document that OPI presented to the committee, but it is just interesting. It talks about the turnover, and like you said, pay is obviously a big part of everything, and not to diminish the need to have a huge focus on that. But when you ask teachers why they leave the profession entirely, it's these 5 things listed in the not the best graphic ever, but still gets the point across. But a lot of it has to do with working conditions. And one of the things we talked about was like some of the behavioral issues. So maybe it's not necessarily someone who falls into that IEP or special needs category, but the behavioral issues coming out of COVID too really pays into the working conditions, the workloads, but just the turnover. And I thought this number that's highlighted is just huge. But 30% of first-year teachers experience turnover, and then 27% of teachers with 2 to 5 years of years of license leave.
Right, and that 26 to 30 demographic, where 30% of teachers are leaving in that category, right? Like I shared the legislation.
People.
Right, I shared the legislation. Like for me personally, I'm going to teach 40 more kids next year. I'm going to have an additional class. They're going to have to take kids out of my class to keep me below state limit. And I'm making $500 less than I did this year because of insurance raises. So it's like that for a veteran teacher, I can take that because I'm, towards the end of my career, I can retire in 4 years. But if you're a new teacher, you can't, right? Like you can't take, when everything crashes down on you, it's a lot of those things. I'm seeing it in my school that they are looking for other jobs. And when we tell teachers that, you're valuable, we're going to try to do these things to retain you, but we do nothing to support it. Like we're not hitting any of these pillars, in my opinion, of things that they talked about that we need to do to retain teachers. I feel like in the buildings, those things are not coming through, right? So the support's not coming through, the better working conditions aren't coming through, the pay is going down. And it's just, when you tell teachers you have to get a second job to live in your community, or we're going to find housing for you because you can't afford to live in your community. As a professional, that's hard to take, I think, especially for a 35-year-old, so I don't know. I know that's not the focus of this group, but I appreciated that conversation, and I appreciated that I didn't feel like in that meeting anyone was saying this isn't a problem. I think everyone agreed it's a problem. That was my take from that meeting, which I really appreciated because I don't always feel like that listening in. And it's just we're going to need some creative solutions to tackle this.
So this document that I brought up is also in the shared drive, so you guys could check it out further. But to go to more of what the hopeful thing that was talked about in the committee and building upon your teacher leader. So this was about the Montana teacher residency. So it's only in its 3rd year. I would say it's basically a pilot, but it's just interesting to see where the first year where the teachers end up, or the second year. But one of the things which is really great about the teacher residency program, and anecdotally of how this one in particular is working, is that the teacher leaders feel really engaged too. So they do get an extra bump of money. It's not huge, but they do get a bump of money. And they feel connected again. They have, as much as being a mentor, they also have someone to lean on and share their day with as well. So some of the teacher leaders have talked about how it's encouraged them to stay in the teaching profession longer. So we're extending their life and being a teacher, which is great. They want to stay and they're enthusiastic about it. And also the new teachers that are coming in have classroom experience, and a lot of the teacher residents have been hired by their school districts. So then they've already built roots there as being there as a student, and then they can come in and really be a part of that community a little bit smoother. So it is a small program right now, but like you said, I thought it was a bright spot and a positive thing to talk about that is going well so far. And the legislature also seems invested in this program as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those cost money. Like I referred to like the SEPA program that I'm a part of through Montana Tech, and they wrote the grant for partnership. And I mean, it's similar. It's not a new teacher, but it's like I took on a mentee and we did this program together. And there was 12 teachers in Montana. We meet every summer, right? And we have this network and we're connected with university professors. And it does a similar type thing to that, but it's very investment heavy, if that makes sense. Like it costs money.
Yes.
It's fewer people who are participation, you know, it's not addressing your 2,000 teachers who are leaving the profession every year, if that makes sense. It's getting a few in, and I agree that it's a bright spot, and I think they're really good models that, you know, you can like try to emulate other places. But once again, it's hard to make it really large scale. So
that was right before this group, we had the rural group where one of the things we're talking about is strengthening mentorships, not just for new teachers, but across the board. And it is especially need in rural areas where you don't have, 50 teachers in a building, 20 teachers in a building, you may only have a handful. So being able to bridge relationships between smaller school districts. And it was something brought up in the committee as well of within the smaller school districts, if they're closer together, can they share teachers in certain ways? And that was something that was very interesting to the rural group too. If you have one of the teachers I talked to in last group, they haven't had a music program for years, but if they are able to share a music teacher with a school that's, within 20 miles, they may actually be able to have that again. So those are all interesting ways to be able to help service the more rural areas. I know you're in Helena. I'm in Helena too.
yeah.
So, but it's
the other thing I was going to say that I
look at it holistically.
Yeah, the other thing that I was going to say that I appreciated, because I had just gone to the SEPA, I presented in Salt Lake, and those projects nationwide are trying to build a biomedical pipeline, right? So it's kind of like what we're trying to do in education, and they're trying to do it in the biomedical field. So they're trying to get kids engaged in biomedical careers because there's a huge shortage there too. And I thought it was really interesting. Just because it was a very similar problem. And what they were doing is they're trying to recruit people from their local communities to go back to their communities, to train them and take them. And so people wanting to serve in the communities that they grew up in. And so there's all sorts of programs doing that, which I think that residency kind of was really trying to focus on that too, is finding people who grew up in communities where there's really high need and to train them and give them alternative pathways to become a teacher with a lot of support so that they're ready. And I appreciated that. And it really paralleled what they were trying to do in the biomedical field, trying to get people, because it's hard to get people to go into rural places all over the country, in medicine as well as education. So I think some of those tactics were really, really similar. And I think some of those programs probably will be really successful. So I was happy to see a lot of those too.
Christina, it looked like you were about to say something.
I'm so, as you know, as you ladies know, I have nothing to do with public schools, and I think that gives me an outside perspective that could help. I really hope, genuinely. And so I'm more here in my mind to throw out ideas that I think would be outside of the box as we've discussed. So nothing to do with, I know nothing about biomedical, so I can't even chime in on that, but, along with a laundry list of other things, I could build a planter box like nobody's business if you guys are interested. So I had an idea, just because part of the reason that I'm unable to work is because, I can't find after school care or, summer care. I know we're talking about generating money and trying to not maybe necessarily tax the people to death to get that money, and people are voting down levies, and the, list goes on. We can't figure out what the heck is happening with the Montana lottery money, apparently. And then a very small percentage of the marijuana money goes anywhere. So, and I've got a whole other opinion on that, but I won't bore you with it because it's just going to make me mad. So an idea. So I had looked into childcare for my kids during the summertime a couple of years ago, and this will blow your mind. I have 3 kids, and it was $15 an hour per kid. So that's $45 an hour. So if I were to put them in 40 hours a week, that ends up being $7,200 a month. What if, maybe and I don't know the logistics behind it, but what if the schools offered summer care as like a daycare type program to switch over to once summer starts? And even if they charged $8 per hour per kid and they had, say, 10 people on staff, if one adult can care for 10 children, that's 10 adults, 100 students. In the long of it, it would generate a $5,000 surplus a month. And what if they use that surplus? So you collect it over the 3 months, that's $15,000. What if they use that as an incentive for teachers to, because this is part of what I'm hearing as well, like be more involved and want to try harder and want to, educate better and feel more appreciated? What if they use that $15,000 of surplus, held it in a pot, and used it as a bonus for the teacher of the year, or used it as a hiring bonus, say $2,000 per, as a hiring bonus, and you could get how many teachers, 6 teachers, 7 teachers on board by providing a $2,000 signing bonus. Again, I'm just here to throw out ideas. That's my only job.
No, I think it's important to be creative. I know some schools do have summer programs or partner with organizations to provide summer programs for students. So depends on the area you're in. I think if there was a possibility of it generating revenue, it could be an idea. I think once you start to build in insurance costs and other things, that I don't know if the revenue would be there necessarily. You might be able to like fund the program so it doesn't run in the red. It would be hard to run the program to the point where it brings in revenue, I think, to enough where teachers would be able to like get bonuses from it.
Well, but they have to pay for insurance 12 years out of the month, right? Because I mean, I know I have to pay insurance 12 years out of the month, even if I don't drive my car in the wintertime.
So I'm looking at Helena's right now. It's called SAC. It's called school age childcare. They have it after school and in the summer. So I just pulled it up. And so for 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, it's $266 a week for care. And then siblings are 10% off after that.
Okay, so then the question is like, what do they do if there's a surplus, or is there a surplus?
I don't think there is. I think that runs the program. So I think about $250 a kid a week runs the program.
Yeah, there's not really direct funding for like after school programs. Like there's not like a pot of money for these programs that comes from the state. So that money funds the programs. And I know there's like Billings and stuff. Larger school districts usually, I think, have more of those programs available. I think that's just the nature of that. But so some of those programs do exist. And we do have another one of our groups. We have a woman who does run some of the summer and after school programs and does it with like the Boys and Girls Club. So, and I know in Billings, they do some partnerships and stuff like that. But it's not a bad idea to ever throw these things out there and always look at how those programs are run and if they can be run differently. Never a bad idea.
Well, I was just thinking, like, if there's any way not to tax the hell out of us, that would be great. And if there's a way to find a surplus profit somewhere else, I just know, like, for me, I'm not going to spend $7,200 a month to put my kids in daycare for them. Their only promise to be that they'll keep them alive.
I know childcare is always, you know, it's always going to be an issue that's interwoven with this as well. And I do know that there's some schools like Lockwood, for instance, does have like a daycare on premises. That's also one of the benefits they have to try to encourage teachers. So different schools do different things, and different school districts obviously have different abilities to provide services to encourage teachers. So, well, before I move on to then like bring up something else we've discussed from the past and bring in some discussion also from the committees and everything last week, I did want to just say, if I know I've been bogarting a lot of time, but Hannah, is there anything that you would like to comment on what we've talked about so far? Anything that you would like to highlight?
No, I don't think so. Not yet.
So I know this ties into the teacher pay, but also kind of the A and B that we discussed in the previous meeting. One of the proposals that was discussed was increasing the quality educator payment. So that was discussed by the legislators, not only in the committee hearings, but also in the constitutional players. So right now there's a quality educator payment. One of the things they talked about was broadening the eligibility, possibly increasing the payment itself. The other thing was put forward not by the legislators, by Lance Melton, was looking at it more of a comprehensive, and I'm going to summarize it very briefly because it obviously this is a lot more complicated. Basically takes pressure off of A and B, less focus on A and B, and more of the money is actually tied to the teacher. So it's the schools are more funded based on the amount of teachers they have and less funded based on the amount of students they have. In his proposal, there's also some changes to how districts, actually the lines of districts and what lines there would be for levies. So there are some more complicated things in there. But just kind of an overview, how do you guys feel about those types of proposals? Do you think that's kind of going in the right direction?
I mean, honestly, at this point, I feel like something's better than nothing.
So you see going towards more of having it more heavily weighted on the teachers that the schools need. I know there's something that was brought up in another group is kind of like building almost the idea of school, and it brings in like, okay, we generally have this amount of students, so we have to have, a fourth, fifth, sixth grade. So we have to provide those classes. So we need these amount of teachers to provide these classes and still fund it based on the teacher. It takes into account how many classes you have. But then if you have those waivers in A and B, a jump or a decrease, you're not losing money because you still have to put that fifth grade. This is more of a small school example, but you still have to have a fifth grade teacher, even if you lost 3 fifth grade students, because you still have 10 other fifth grade students you have to serve. So is that something you guys see going in the right direction, I guess?
Yeah. The funny thing is, and I've mentioned this before, is that the private sector, so companies and stuff, kind of work in a similar fashion. So I'll just give an example. Like I worked at a community for a retirement community, and we typically had 135 residents. But if we drop down to 132 residents in our community, our budget in the kitchen got dropped down by like $500. So it's not like the people ate less. But our budget ended up getting dropped exponentially, and it's like, okay, but we only really lost 3 people. So that kind of metrics has never really made any sense to me. As far as what you're saying about, fifth grade teacher loses 3 students, well, but they still have all the other students to teach. They still have to be there the same amount of hours a day. They still have to put in the same amount of work. What difference does it make if they've lost a few students? If I'm understanding that right.
Yeah, and I'm trying to be an impartial arbiter of information and where people stand on things. So that's kind of, and again, I simplified something that is a complicated proposal, but just trying to keep it high level for our discussion. But that's kind of the argument. You summarized it right there.
I don't know if that solves our problem though of giving schools more money. You're just shifting the money a little bit. Like there's no additional money coming in, which is my concern. And it seems easier for smaller and elementary schools, right? Like I look at my high school, and one of the problems that we had in budget cuts is that like, you know, there's a disproportionate impact on some people because when you cut a teacher, you can't cut it across the school, right? And so I think we'd still have the problems of looking at whole programs getting cut and things like that in our larger schools, if that makes sense. Like it might make sense in like, I like the idea of looking at a funding formula for different size schools, right? And like in an elementary, it seems to make sense. There's a little simpler staffing. But I don't know like when you decide what teachers are and aren't needed. Do you, like in a high school that's big, for example, which is my experience. And I still think it doesn't hit the funding issue that like where's the extra money going to come from? If we say this school, you know, needs more funding, we still don't have that money. So
Well, I know Christina, you've talked about, and I think a lot of people seem really enthusiastic about finding a way to tax the second home, especially of out-of-state residents. Finding that they should carry a little bit more of the property tax burden than those who, live and reside in the state the whole time. And it does seem like I've seen some discussions on that from legislators, but overall the group, that just seems like a very popular way to at least find another funding stream.
Well, it's like I've said, I feel like they get all the benefits of Montana without any of the consequences. So they're not the ones trying to figure out, as a teacher, if I were to put myself in that place, it's like, where am I going to live? How am I going to afford to live there on this pay, with the burdens that are coming along with it and no support? So they don't have to deal with any of that because they don't live here. So I feel like it is a fair thing to do. I know that places like California, not that I am using them as a glorying example of anything, but places like California do that. And you do get taxed extra if you have a second home that you don't necessarily live in. And I know that is, our population doubles in the summertime, and it doubles in the summertime. A good majority of that percentage, from my understanding, is from people like that. And again, as I've said, when I look at all these empty homes and teachers can't find a place to live and there's no subsidizing it or anything like that, in addition to them being, the people across the street never live there, so they pay the same taxes I do, that doesn't seem quite fair.
And I know being creative with the funding streams is, and sorry, Christina, so I know this is going to be repetitive to you, but I think Sarah might be interested. So this is from fiscal year 2023, but I think again, it gives a good picture of how many different funding streams there are for education. So this is just for the public lands. So it is just interesting to see $323 per student basically in fiscal year 2023 on top of the $9 million for the facility and technology fund. So there are like, our funding is diversified in some ways in Montana, but I think especially, so you can also look historically where the funding in fiscal year 2023, it was up. So, but you can see in other years it's down. But I think that highlights the importance for us to be creative, like that housing thing, and think of other revenue streams that can enable us to do something like a quality and teacher incentive payment. Oh my God, there's too many acronyms. And actually put more money into it and not just, as Sarah said, kind of have the same pieces on the board, just move them around, but actually be able to increase funding. So being creative with revenue streams. So I know last time we talked about like having tagging specific things. I know we can talk about marijuana and lottery money. We see kind of, it's straightforward where that kind of goes and it doesn't really go to education. But also we talked about like flagging, a 1 cent gas tax increase, something like that. So other things that you guys are thinking about as far as revenue sources, that again, we try to get away from that, the burden on the property taxes and try not to increase the cost of living for Montanans.
This may not be the right time, but you know, as I was trying to think about it, I was thinking about the federal component. Right? And putting
Mhm.
pressure on the federal component to fund things like special education fully, which is a federal mandate. Right? Because I mean, the funding is not just a Montana problem. There's a nationwide problem with federal funding as well. So I think putting some pressure on our national level delegates to increase the federal funding for some of these things might be worthwhile in this whole conversation, which is outside our scope probably, but maybe as OPI or as legislators, you know, like,
No,
I mean,
well, I don't think at all. I think you're right.
okay,
I
but
think
like,
it does play a piece, and one of the things we can do in the white paper is put in that you guys request basically that the legislature, not just you guys as individuals, but request that the education committees formally like request that our federal representatives take action on that. So it's not just, oh, I as a constituent, it's also I as a constituent, I'm asking our local representatives to put more pressure federally as well. So that can definitely be included in, although I'll be in a previous world, in a previous life, I worked for a congressman a decade ago. And we talked about IDEA. God, I'm bad with my acronyms today. We talked about it back then. So it is a long running discussion and issue, and it's not going to go away overnight, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, raise the concerns to the local level so they can put more pressure on the federal level. So it all ties together, even if it is harder to change things.
yeah. And then just another idea when you were talking about property taxes and second homes, right? Like I've always appreciated when you have like, when you register your car, how you drive an old car and you don't pay as much, right? Versus a new car, and then that tax is like the registration fees are way higher, right? And so you have people who are living, who are getting new cars all the time and can afford that, then they're paying more money for some of these other things. So I don't know where that would fit in educational funding. It's not quite the second house idea, right? Like, but maybe along the same lines at some point, right? Where if there's a place in educational funding where that, I don't know, where there's something like that. And I think that's kind of like the sin tax idea, right? When you're spending money on these other things, then that you are taxed higher on these things that are more like luxury type of items, if that makes sense. And so I don't know if you could do it with property taxes. I mean, especially as home prices have just inflated so much that you're going to be inflating the people who are living in the houses. I don't know.
No, it's one of the things I know.
It just came to my mind. It's not well thought out.
No, but it's not out of the realm of what people have discussed. So one of the things they talked about is like if it's more of property tax relief for people who have been in their homes, like especially like you said, there's people who have property taxes who have gone up 50%, but they've lived in that home since 1970. They're not millionaires, but now all of a sudden their house is worth $1 million. So there has been discussions of kind of like, I guess it's almost like a grandfathering in clause, or if you've lived in the home, it's actually like the value doesn't actually go up until it's sold again. So those are like, and then it's taxed at that higher level. So the person, you don't get your property taxes like constantly. It doesn't go up 100% while you're living there. But when you sell it, the next person who buys it at that higher level does have that higher property tax level.
And that, I think my sister lives in Las Vegas and they did that there. They capped their property taxes when they had the huge dive and when at 2009 or whatever, and it can only raise at like 1% a year. But they're finding problems as people aren't moving, right? Because
people aren't moving right now.
And my sister hasn't moved because she's staying in her house because her taxes are $1,000 a year because Vegas has all the gambling, whatever, right? Like their property taxes are a lot less. But if she were to buy a house just like in a little nicer neighborhood, she'd be paying $3,000 or $4,000 a year, right? So it's kept people where they are, which is a really interesting side effect of that. But it's really nice for her, right? Because my property taxes have gone through the roof. Hers has, 1% on $1,000 a year. You're not raising. It's not costing anyone else out of their house, which is nice too. So,
For every action, there is an equal and
Yep.
opposite reaction, right? So there's
And
always
that's,
pros and
yeah,
cons.
that's exactly what I was going to say. Actually, I've asked my parents many times, what's it going to take for you to move out of California? Because this is ridiculous, just watching all the legislature and all the BS that's going on. And they said one thing, Article 13. And I'm like, what the heck is Article 13? And they said Article 13 is a law that was put in place in like 1973 that said something along the lines of you couldn't raise people's property taxes by a certain amount in a certain amount of time. And they said, so our property taxes are low and they'll stay low as long as they don't get rid of Article 13. And I said, but if they do, because at this rate, I wouldn't be surprised. And they said, well, if they do, that's what it's going to take. And I'm like, okay, well, cool. See you moving soon because it's California.
There's I I know there's been talks about repealing that in California, but I was thinking like in New Jersey, for instance, but it doesn't. My parents live in New Jersey. There's actually a exit tax. So when you sell your house in New Jersey, if you move to another state, they keep a percentage of your sales on the house when you leave the state. If you buy a house within the state, you get to keep that money.
Yeah, California's trying to do an estate tax where it's like if you move, basically anything you earn there, they keep. And so I've asked them about that because they keep not bragging. I don't want to say bragging, but they have a lot of money and they're like, oh yeah, when we die, you're going to have like X amount of $1 million, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but am I really?
Hey, well, we can just direct that to Montana schools.
what about,
But
I don't know, what about like, I don't know that the bed tax is the right thing, but like one of the things like, you look at sales tax and they generate all that income from people who aren't living in the state. Right. And so I know like some resort towns have some of that in there, right? They have a resort tax.
a hotel tax. Yeah.
Hotel tax.
Right. And so it's like, I mean, I'm trying to think, are there things like that? And I don't know that the hotel tax is the right place to put it, but are there things like that that you're getting other people and not just always putting it on people in Montana? And I think that was the idea behind the gas tax, that you'd be getting some of that, right? But like you look and I go to Washington on vacation and I'm paying a ton of taxes to Washington and they're using my money to fund their public education and they're using my money to fund all this stuff. And I don't know that Montana has as many ways to generate that income for being a really tourist heavy state.
No,
Does
I
that make
agree.
sense?
And I've actually kind of said the same thing. It's like with the over there in the mountain across, why is it escaping my mind? But in Bozeman, you've got Bill Gates who has a property there and David Letterman and all these people. And that club generates $200,000 a year just in dues. So if you have 100 people living there at $200,000 a year, who again benefit from all the beauty and glory that is Montana, and clearly have the billions of dollars it takes to purchase property out there, build property out there, as well as pay the dues that are required to even have a property out there that they only go to 2 weeks out of the year, then I feel like there should be some kind of participation there as far as they're concerned with helping out the place that they apparently love so much.
So just throwing ideas out there because I don't know how you would actually implement this on just a state level. But they have basically the opposite of this when you travel to certain countries where you don't have to pay as many taxes because you are a visitor. But I was thinking you could probably do that opposite. You don't have a Montana ID, you have to pay. You could do an additional tax on almost anything, but you can even have an additional hotel tax. So you're still not capturing Montanans that are, taking a weekend trip up to or down to Bozeman or whatever, but you're capturing the out-of-staters. So you could just have taxes. You're putting an onus on business owners, possibly, or you could have a tax rebate where you're taxing things that might capture Montanans, but they get a tax rebate at the end of the year based on whatever, a calculation or based on receipts or based on
Zip code, maybe when you rent a hotel based on how you input your zip code of where you live.
Yep. Well, it depends on how you want to collect those taxes or give those taxes back to Montanans on at what point you do that, but there are
But I think
ways.
yeah, there's a lot of those, right? There's a local fee for a zoo or something like that, right? Like if you
Yep,
can show
you have
your
the local
ID,
discount, yeah,
right? Like, I mean, I think that's commonly done in a lot of things,
right.
you know, and I mean, you know, traveling, right? I'm going to Seattle. I'm just picking on Washington, right? Like I'm going to Seattle and every hotel there has that taxes, right? So if I'm going to go to Seattle, I'm going to go to Seattle and that extra $4 on the hotel room doesn't matter to me as a consumer because everyone has that extra $4, right? And
Yeah,
so the businesses may not love the idea, right? Because you tack on taxes at taxes, but I think in practicality, most people who go there like, well, they're just added $20 to my hotel room, but everyone's doing it. So when I compare apples to apples, you know,
you wouldn't, I mean, the reality is you probably wouldn't have to add that even $20.
no,
Because
no,
Montana doesn't
I'm just
need a
making it.
million, there's millions of tourists, so it doesn't even have to be that substantial really to add another revenue source.
And I do like the
Right.
rebate
And
idea, but
if we can do a little bit here, a little bit there, and smush it together. I read an article a couple of weeks ago. I think it was Jefferson County had to cut PE and art from their next year's curriculum. And when I read stuff like that, it's heartbreaking because it's like, you've got to be kidding me. I know the state generates a ton of money from all sorts of resources. So when you see something like that happen, you go, how? How is that even possible? And if we can even, just pull from one area of ideas that we have had or another or another or another and stitch them together like a quilt, then do that.
So if I'm wrong, let me know. But even if we raise taxes at this point, even if it's earmarked for education, unless the funding formula is fixed, it isn't helping the schools. I mean, and I think, we've seen that with the property tax increase. Montanans just got a really significant property tax increase, and it's not going to schools, even though property taxes are earmarked for education, because the funding formula is in such a manner that it doesn't let schools be properly funded, which is why programs are getting cut and teachers aren't getting paid enough. And, the teachers are asked to make less money and teach more students, and it's all a problem. And so I guess raising taxes more, no matter how creative we are, really doesn't fix the problem that needs to be fixed, because until schools are funded properly with a funding formula that works, taxes are going to continue to get increased because schools are going to continue to try to pass levies and bonds to make up the difference.
Well, I think we were trying to bring those two things together. So we were touching on kind of adjusting the formula and adjusting a formula in a way that it was more teacher heavy, right? So we're going to make sure that the funding is based on the teachers, based on the salary needed for the teachers. So that was what we were talking about, adjusting the funding formula. And I know one of the gentleman last time, and I'm forgetting which one it was, but he was talking about adjusting the formula fundings too. And I know the funding formula is already complicated, but one of the things he brought up was having kind of 4 different funding formulas possibly for the AA, A, B, and C schools, to be more, I guess, in tune and conducive to the differing needs between those different classes of schools.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea. And I think tying the formula to somehow to the teachers works, sort of, as long as it's not just shifting the money and it's like additional dollars. Because I mean, small schools and big schools have the same problem. If you have 75 students, you need 3 classrooms for 3rd grade. But then if you lose 10 of them, you still need 3 classes because of 3rd grade, because you want to be within accreditation standards. So, it happens everywhere, but that's the problem that they all face if it's just tied to A and B. So I like separating it from that a bit.
yeah, and I agree. I think it's going to be the holistic approach. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was asking questions, they said that the state trust land does all go to schools. So they said if that revenue increases, that doesn't go back to the general fund. Is that
Yeah.
correct? Right, so
Yeah,
I think,
so-
like, if
so-
you work it in somehow with your revenue, as long as they write it correctly, that they could say, this is school, this is to increase school. This isn't like, there's no way for that money to go back to a general fund because we're fully funded. Like, this money will go to a school pot somehow. Is there a way to do that?
Yeah. And then, so those specific 5 million acres of land that were ceded by the federal government, it's specifically for the purposes of schools. So that was, and I put that presentation in the share drive so you can look at it and there's more resources. It is from fiscal year 2023, because that's how we have the whole numbers. But it does kind of give, I think, a good overview of that. But yeah, those lands are specifically, those public trust lands are specifically for funding education. And it kind of goes into how what revenue is collected on that, because it's different. Some of it's grazing, some of it's mineral leases. So there's different ways that we get the revenue from that land. But yes. And that is something to look at too. If there's and I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not an expert in public lands, but that's ways that there are ways that we can look at that or talk to people about is there ways we can leverage that. And Christina, what you're talking about, that patchwork, it might not be a windfall of money if we can leverage that in different ways, but it could be a couple million or something. I'm just speculating, but
Right,
just
right.
thinking about that patchwork of, you have a couple million here, and then again, that's the way, then you roll that into adjusting the funding formula. And it seems like a lot of you guys like the idea of having, and I know one of the proposals did have A and B as a component, but had a heavier weight with funding the teachers needed and the teachers at a better salary. So they all intertwine.
In our house, we call it robbing Peter to pay Paul. You just kind of like piece it together long enough to limp you along to get where you need to go in the time you need to get there.
Don't we all know that? But there's other ways, we can look at how the funding formula can be adjusted. Or I know another gentleman, it was a different one, and I'm not going to remember his name either. But when you talk about gym or music or art classes being cut, you could talk about having, specific funding going for those things. Just like how it's obviously a little bit different because it's more built on what's in our Constitution. It's not required in our Constitution to have gym class. It's not written, right? That I'm being broad. But having Indian education in our schools is, so schools do get a chunk of money for each student, specifically for Indian education. So if, the people of Montana feel like a certain thing is very important to them, that the students have a focus on this, there are ways that the state could fund a specific program for each student. The school gets a chunk of money for each student to ensure that that lesson is taught. I know that was a little bit granular.
Well, I actually like that idea of being in a school, right? Because you look at it and, like being a locally controlled school, like system, right? Like my school district gets to choose where they spend the money. Right. And like, I think for the district, they look at things that are easy to cut financially. Right. And some of those things are, I feel, what the community values the most, if that makes sense. And I feel like, in a lot of ways, from what I've heard from the legislature, what they value. Right. And so I think having some of that money set aside for some of these things that we know are really important for communities and for children, right? Like, I picture a 7-year-old going to school and sitting all day and not having the creative time and not having some of these experiences, which I know the legislature is really into, right? They're into this idea of creativity and innovation and some of that stuff that just seems to be totally cut as budget cuts are happening, right? Like I think having incentives for keeping those programs, it might be important. Just when it comes down to balancing a budget, you're gonna cut what's easy to cut and I don't know, it's not always what's best for kids, you know? And so, I don't know.
I totally understand what you're saying. Actually, a lady hit on it pretty um accurately in the last meeting that we were at, which is that so it's like a domino effect. If you have, say, a kid with ADHD and they're a problem kid and they cause a lot of issues in class, and the teacher has to spend extra time with them instead of the other students because they're, for lack of a better word, a problem child. I find with having a child with ADHD, something that's helpful is that PE time and that art time, because that's their um, like hyper attention outlet. But if those kids who are causing problems and then causing the teachers to have to take a substantial amount of time out of their other class, students to spend time with that person, and then you take away PE and art, and they're only two outlets to get some of that energy out. We call them the wiggles in our house. Then what's the domino effect that creates? Because as you said, like, it seems like the easiest thing to cut, but is it the most beneficial? And I would say probably not. I would agree completely.
And I think, there is a big focus on innovation in education right now. There are certain ways that our state and our country has been innovative, but I think there's lots of ways that we all agree that we have not kept up with the times. And I think the legislature always talks about being innovative and preparing people for, this new world of technology and everything, and what the careers are looking for are looking forward for the future. And we want schools to be creative, but I think there's something that we're seeing here is that schools, even if they want to be creative, do not have the leeway to be creative because they don't have the flexibility and the resources to be creative.
And the other thing I appreciated from that meeting is that they realized that, like, our leaders don't have the leadership capacity right now, right? Because I think the way that it was said is the superintendents viewed the building principals as doers. And that's how I feel. I feel like the building administration are doers. They're going out, they're putting out fires, they're doing things all the time. And that strategic leadership has been taken away from them. And I think that's a funding issue. They don't have the paras, their teachers are worked so hard, right? Like, there's all these things that they have that the building administration is trying to pick up all these additional duties. And so, like, I really appreciated that comment. And I agree with that. I think that, that strategic focus and that change and innovation, we haven't had the capacity to do that because we're just looking at our toes and trying to barely survive. We're trying to get the food on the table, right, is what we're trying to do. And so I appreciated that comment too, that I think it's systemic, right? And if you give your leaders a chance to be innovative and thoughtful and move ahead, that they may have more of a capacity to make some of those changes and see more holistically, as opposed to just saying it's easy to cut art or it's easy to cut music, and looking at a whole, systemic approach. But
And I think what was interesting about the ESSER and COVID dollars is that we did see touches of innovation. And one thing I think you might be interested in, Sarah, is that Kira brought it up in the last group, was that one of the schools hired a family engagement person with their ESSER dollars. It was a temporary position, but it was literally to bring the families in to the school so they felt more connected. And I think that starts to bridge some of the disconnect between the communities and not understanding the needs of the schools or what's happening there, and not approving of the levies. And I think there is a disconnect. And I thought that was interesting that they were able to use the COVID dollars to start to engage the community more, bring the parents in, have them understand what's happening at the schools, teach them ways that they can check, like use Infinite Campus to check their students' progress and grades, but having the parents be more engaged that way. And I think that starts to solve, we talk about parent engagement being really important. But I thought it was an interesting way that they use their ESSER dollars. We talked about it. But we saw touches of innovation with the influx of ESSER. And I think it's, what lessons do we take from that? What could we have been doing before COVID? COVID forced some innovation. And what could we have been doing before COVID that we learned from COVID? Obviously a bad situation, but there was forced innovation through that we could see how we could integrate that going forward. We don't have to just go back to what it was pre-COVID. We could take those lessons and build upon them. Well, I know our time is running short here, so I kind of just want to do kind of a quick review of how we see this going forward. You guys have put a lot of proposals together. We have this kind of broad outline. What I'll be doing is preparing another kind of one pager, but it's going to be a little bit more formal. I'm going to start putting things into buckets to start being the skeleton outline of what the white paper will end up being. Just starting to prepare for our July meeting. Now, there's a lot of resources in the shared drive to take a look at if you want to deep dive into anything, but my door is always open, so don't like hesitate. It's like, oh, I had this idea. Just shoot it to me in email and I can incorporate it into our notes, into the white paper. You can put it in the shared drive. I can incorporate it from there. I know some of the other groups started emailing each other too. So if you guys connect with someone in the group that you think had similar ideas, you want to bounce ideas off each other, I encourage you guys to connect with me or without me. But if there's, before I kind of wrap up, and again, thank you guys for taking some time away from, your personal lives on a beautiful, beautiful warm night, and listen to me talk. But is there anything you guys need from me at the moment? Otherwise, ask me anytime if there's information or data or anything I could pull from you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your guys' time. I really enjoyed talking about all these things, and I will not diminish the importance of not just like, we can look and see what's achieved at the end of the day, but conversations sometimes in like policy initiatives, they take a long time, and having the conversations and raising the concerns and talking to people about it really at the end of the day is what gets the job done. So sometimes it might feel like you're spinning your wheels, but having conversations like this with each other and with others is truly important and what gets things done at the end of the day. I've seen it many times where you think like, this can never get done, this can never happen. And maybe it doesn't happen at that moment, but I've seen things turn around and get done. So I really appreciate. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
One more idea. Something else, like talking about like the school trust, like for insurance trust, right? And the legislature put up
the health
aside,
insurance.
like, the health insurance, right? Like put aside $40 million or whatever to start that program or whatever, right? I mean, that would be another idea. I don't know that it's sustainable, but maybe, right? Like if there was a $2 billion surplus again, if there was some pot that could be set aside for building maintenance, for teacher, whatever, whatever was the most important thing that could grow in revenue and be sustainable as a pot. So it'd be a one-time money, but that wouldn't disappear somehow, right? Does that make sense? Like you're not just going to dish out that one-time money. You're not going to say, okay, schools, you get this money right away.
Yep.
It's something that could be loaned to schools for low interest rate, or you know what I mean? Like the interest on it could be ready to like give out so that would be sustainable and like available for future.
Yeah. No, like,
does that make sense?
No, it does. But there's lots of funds like throughout all the states, and even in Montana, like the coal fund, like that gains interest. And then the interest is actually used to fund the things.
Right. So like if no one can say if there's going to be a surplus again or not. Like, I don't know that they know if there's going to be, but like if there is additional money, like we know with ESSER, the programs go away then, right? And we don't want that. But to have some of these things set up to be sustainable if there's extra money. So
yeah, a pot of money that, you use like, or I mean, there's things like this where they actually use that pot of money to invest, which can be risky, but then you also can get 8 or 10% returns. So then you have that 8 or 10% to actually reinvest. So there's lots of funds and pots of money and stuff like that. And let me check if there's any other states that are doing something like that, specifically more geared towards education, because a lot of times it is more like health insurance things, and not necessarily like, oh, this is what we're going to use for transportation or building maintenance. But let me see if there's any states doing something like that, because that is interesting. Well, very, very nice discussion, ladies. I can say that because we're all ladies this time. But like I said, my door is always open. Feel free to shoot me a note or anything, and we'll just keep talking and working at this together. And again, I appreciate your time and enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank you.